Hello, everyone. It's Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive. Welcome back. I've got a very special guest with me today. It's Cameron Gordon from ANU in Australia, Canberra in Australia, but also originally from the United States. And Cameron is an economist and economic historian who's just written a fascinating book, The World of Many Possibilities. Welcome, Cameron.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Cameron, we're going to have a really fascinating discussion today about your book, which is Economic History of the World, really since 1800, but it's also like an intellectual, social history of that transformation. But also, you've also recently written an article about technocracy. And one could say that you are a technocrat in a way. I mean, you're a economist, you have a PhD in economics, you've had a diverse public service career, including working for the United States Congress. You're initially a US citizen. Congress Committee for Taxation, you can't get more technocratic than that, really, can you? As well as doing various academic roles in Spain and the United States and Australia as well. But your work is also, I guess, unusual for economists because, economists are the ultimate technocrat, but you're very sort of self-reflective on what it actually means to be an economist or a technocrat, or the sort of intellectual history of economics. And I just wonder if maybe we could start there and just your reflections on your own career as a technocrat, but then how that sort of feeds into the academic and the writing that you've done since.
Yes, so thanks, Jeff. Well, I will keep it very short. This could be a long story. So I actually originally was thinking about becoming an historian. So that's part of it. I was always very interested in economics, but more oriented towards being an historian. And for various reasons, decided that I'd have more employability as an economist. So I sort of dropped the idea of getting a PhD in economics in history, and decided to get a PhD in economics. But I was at a place where you could specialize in economic history. So that was kind of my compromise. But already I was a bit sort of an oddball in economics. And when I was taking graduate courses, I took, you could take 4 electives, and I took courses in history and I took courses in philosophy. And this is very unusual amongst economic graduate students. They generally stay right in economics. So I've always had that interest. And then basically, without making a long story, I worked in government first for about 20 years. And so and I ended up specializing in infrastructure and transportation after being in tax and budget. And all those experiences, what ended up happening was that I was applying models and theories I'd learned, but I was doing them in the real world and doing like real tasks. I was often working on very specific things like, tax revenue estimation, for example, and, cost benefit analysis of transport projects. And what I more and more began to see was that the real world and the theory, economic theory although it purports to explain everything, and it did. When I was a graduate student, it seemed kind of cool. It's like, wow, all these explanations, everything is understandable according to this model. But as I was really working in the real world, I just saw that there's a lot of stuff left out, and including basically human beings, the psychology of institutions, organizations, the way things really work. And also things, growing up in New York City when I did, and then working in New York City government at my first job, and Washington, D.C. later, seeing basically a lot of the corruption people don't talk about, and supposedly the developed world doesn't have so much of. But anyway, so I could go on about that. But basically, I sort of developed this thing like, well, actually, I have to be pretty polyglot to really understand the world. There's some good things in economic theory, but you can't just rely on that as the way of looking on the world. And so anyway, even though, and then just to sum it up, I was very interested in being a sort of a technocrat. I didn't think of myself that way, but because I was interested in politics and power, but I didn't want to be directly identified with it, which is true of a lot of technocrats. I wanted to get the knowledge and get the right solutions and advise. And if they didn't use that advice, okay, that's fine. But but I wanted to have sort of honesty and yet wanted to have influence. And I saw basically the limits of that kind of approach, not least of which is that often our models and technical people often don't really know what they're talking about. I don't mean that as a casting aspersions, but there's a lot of stuff we just don't know and can't know. So anyway, that's a bit of a ramble, but that's sort of kind of how I became interested in broader interdisciplinary approaches, particularly to economic history.
Yeah. And I think before, as we were talking, you said you describe yourself as a recovering technocrat.
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, exactly, because it is kind of true. I really did sort of drink the Kool-Aid in a lot of ways. And then eventually it sort of wore off. So I'm now looking at it from the outside, but being fully trained in it and understanding how people think and, respecting the good parts of being a technocrat, but seeing the real limits of it.
And I mean, I know from my own experience in government, there is a zone of, space, if you like, where between, well, I mean, I often make a distinction between politics and government. Like there's, not all the things that happen in government are, highly political, sort of things. I mean, some of them are immensely practical things. And you've done some of that sort of stuff with big, infrastructure projects that has its politics, but there's also a technical, if you like, component of it. But technocracy as a concept is a sort of a particular, maybe an overvaluation of the technical side of solving social problems that you've really looked at in your work as well, haven't you?
Yes. So, I mean, as we were chatting in the beginning, I've just written an article recently about technocracy, the history and the concepts. And, essentially, I mean, technocracy was born formally as a concept with industrialization, where you were really building and have built this huge, complex system of production, distribution, and consumption at scale. That's the world we live in now, and that's the world, of course, that got set in place very firmly by the middle of the 19th century. And so technocracy kind of seemed very appealing and seemed very necessary. And that was the whole notion of the original notion of technocracy by Saint-Simon in France, was the idea was that, well, the most important thing is productivity. And who knows productivity better than the industrialists? And in particularly, it was interesting because a lot of times we think of scientists as being the leaders, but Saint-Simon was very specific about the industrialists, the people who actually gathered the capital, made the decisions, and he actually thought bankers, particularly central bankers, which should be the main allocators of capital, and the technicians were actually secondary. But the idea was that you needed skill and specialization to run a complex economy, and by definition, nothing should get in the way of that, including politics. This was the idea. So the original idea was very sort of pure. And then, of course, it became problematic pretty much immediately for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that basically all decisions you mentioned this, like with infrastructure, for example, and transport, there is a technical component to these systems. For example, you have to understand the techniques behind them. You have to understand the technologies. But basically, decisions of what to build, where to build, what services to offer. This is just an infrastructure, are political. And technocrats can't make those decisions fundamentally. I mean, and in fact, what happens is they don't make those decisions. That's the other thing too. So, I don't know if I quite answered your question, but that was
no, absolutely. And I guess, I mean, the term technocracy has become quite controversial, I guess, in recent times, maybe given, put on steroids during the COVID pandemic, et cetera, in part because, there were these various technical models of reality that guided policy that may or may not have been all that. They weren't necessarily accurate maps of reality, I guess, and people can have their different viewpoints upon that. But in many ways, your book, which is about the economic history of 1800, since 1800, I mean, the first chapter of that is old models, new realities, and it does describe this way in which we all tend to hang on to models of reality that reality sort of bypasses to some degree. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that idea sort of shaped your thinking about writing the history of, economic history since 1800?
No, sure.
The Industrial Revolution sort of thing?
Yes. Just on a personal note, of course, I grew up, I was trained as an economist, but I also grew up during the Cold War. But I grew up in New York City, which is a strange place to grow up. Went bankrupt in the 1970s and was falling apart. The whole country was kind of falling apart in the 70s.
And it was in pretty bad state in the 80s or 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, no, and it continued to be bad. But 70s when everything sort of came apart. And then meanwhile, but there was a strange thing about, well, wait a second, we're sort of the greatest country in the world, the greatest city in the world, how New Yorkers think of it. We're the free world versus the communist world, And I went to graduate school during this time, so that was kind of interesting because, we did actually read some Marxist analysis because, you've kind of, if you wanted, particularly economic history, not in my main classes. My main classes that didn't exist, but when I took economic history, for example, or history of economic thought, we read about alternative analyses. And so there's this kind of thing about, well, right there already, this is just sort of percolating. There's this idea about the influence of ideas and how it basically not only shapes, but can dictate the way you look at the world. And you basically don't see things that are right in front of you, and you see things that aren't there, which is one definition of insanity, of course. But so that was already kind of in there. And again, just the real world, I was living in this very turbulent real world and studying this turbulent real world. And I began to work in this turbulent real world, which didn't match at all what was supposed to be happening. And then when I got into economic history, and particularly getting back to the book, what you really see very clearly when you look, at least when I look, particularly in an interdisciplinary way, at the world economy since 1800 and the whole process of industrialization, is you see, first of all, it is not what standard economic theory says it is. So standard economic theory, and I taught a class, this is how the book came out of it. I taught a class, World Economy since 1800, and this is how the book came out of that, because I was pushing against the standard approach, which is that basically nothing happened economically in human history until about, 1700.
1780 or something, yeah. 1750.
Maybe 1500, you start getting 1400, you start getting...
Yeah, that's right, of course.
So there is some of that.
The Medici or something, yeah.
Some things happening, but then basically nothing's happening. This is called the Malthusian trap. And of course, it's already very narrowly defined, basically gross domestic product per capita. This is kind of the metric, right, that dictates. And then something happened, and basically they don't really explain it exactly, but the idea in statement of economic theory is that incentives shifted, basically. People saw reasons to accumulate capital and then invest the surplus in productive investments, and then that's basically set off this, and it happened in the West. Right. And of course, most of your standard approach in the class I was teaching, which I took over from somebody else, which I didn't totally throw out, but I adapted, was that story. Well, why did it happen in the West? What happened in the West? Was it institutions? Was it, culture? Was it, in a very narrow sense? Was it the political system, the liberal political system of England, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And why didn't it happen in the East? Now, this is pretty orthodox stuff, and a lot of even orthodox economic historians are really questioning this. But still, the story comes like, well, there's some incentives have shifted, and now we have this magical productivity. And like I always like to say, if you are looking for something, you're going to find it, right? If you are very dead set on finding something, you will find it. And this paradigm, which I'd already been sort of questioning and sort of looking into, when I taught the classes, really forced me to sort of say, well, already. And I from the get-go, I said, actually, wait a second. There's a lot of funny things about this. Not least is the idea is that the human being is immutable throughout all this. All these changes that happen in industrialization don't affect the human being. We're just rational, atomistic, maximizing, selfish agents, right? That's your standard Homo economicus. That's what you are. And nothing has changed. That's the way it is. And of course, what happens is, something shifted, not really clear what it was, but it shifted. And now it's sort of freed up the sort of maximizing rational individual, and markets were just created out of this, and they just sort of took off after this. And I just said, this doesn't make any sense. And yet, I'll argue with a lot of my colleagues, sometimes vociferously over these points. And I can understand where they're coming from. They really believe the model itself is reality. And they're trained in that way. And of course, if you're in an academic department, which I was, I'm the Crawford School of Policy now, but I was in the economics department for a while there. All your incentives are to publish in the top journals, economic journals. And what do those ask for? They ask for you to follow the model, test the model, use all the standard methods. I mean, I stopped going to seminars in economics because I was just tired of hearing the same old thing. If I heard another thing about instrumental variables, it was like I said, I can't stand this anymore. Even topics I was interested in, like economic history, I said, I can't stand this. Where's the history? So I think really what we're now, so that's one point. The other point I'll just make is that industrialization was and has been a very sort of turbulent, violent. There's been a lot of violence in it. There's been a lot of force. It's been a process at mass that's become increasingly mass. And now what's happened in a weird way is we had this model of reality that was grounded in real events. I mean, obviously industrialization happened. The question is why. But then there were decisions made, by people at all levels, but also including state actors, saying, okay, let's make this the worldwide system. This is the goer. And the most important thing is gross domestic product. Not before we had that, but gross domestic product or total output. At first, just total output, and then total output per person became sort of more important. And then we've built a world now, right? This is the funny thing is that in some sense we've created a reality that matches the model that we set out with. And of course, it still doesn't work in that sense. There's still a reality beyond it. But from a technocratic point of view, if you really believe in this idea of technocracy, in the purest sense of the word, so this is wonderful. We figured out what works, and we've designed the world according to the tablets that have come down from the mountain. And isn't that beautiful? And so there's this weird interaction. And I look at this in my history books, like how did people change? How were they changed? How were they changed individually? How were they changed collectively? How did that then feed back into the economic changes that were going on? And so this dynamic interplay, that's really kind of what I think really happens in real life. And so anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but that's kind of really
no, it's fantastic. And in a way, the classic measure of the way in which an economy's size is measured, GDP, you can see the cracking apart of this sort of model at the moment in the debate about, well, is gross domestic product the right measure of the economy, or is the PPP, I can never quite get it's right, the purchasing power parity measure, the sort of, if you like, the money economy versus the real economy sort of measure. You can see the argument about that. And it also has very broad sort of international implications as well, because, measured by one way, America is the biggest economy in the world. Measured by another way, China is the biggest economy in the world, and all that sort of stuff. So it's a very fundamental example of the way in which an idea about the economy has sort of become embedded and sort of reflect, sort of fed on itself in a way, but then you can also see how within the discipline itself, people have started to say, hang on, this doesn't quite make sense. Now, another way in which this big transformation is often talked about is as the great, what's it called? The Great Divergence. So, the historian Kenneth Pomerantz wrote the book about, it was part of, a squillion books that try to explain why the West took off and the rest of the world didn't. His explanation, I can't quite remember exactly his explanation, but yeah, well, what was it?
I talk about that in the book. I taught about it in the class. Pomerantz is quite influential in the field, and interesting case for him. He's pretty much kind of firmly neoclassical economic historian, but a very evidence-based. I mean, very historically oriented, and so this whole thing about great divergence. So there's the great divergence, and then there's the great convergence. This is this sort of idea. So the great divergence was around 1700, but particularly 1800. This big divergence between the West per capita GDP and the East per capita GDP, right? And that continued until basically, the 1970s, really. It depends. So if you look at just that data, then you have started having this convergence, and that gets into multipolarity, which we'll get to later. But so, and again, this is really, again, back what I was saying earlier, there was this notion about, well, this happened, and why did it happen? And for a long time, there was essentially, it wasn't called this, but there was essentially a sort of, I'd say, Western exceptionalism. And sometimes, particularly in the beginning, a British exceptionalism, right? So at first it was Britain is unique. Very unique in all its, the freedoms that people have, and the sort of there was some debate about how innovative their people were, but it was a nation of tinkerers rather than the rationalists of France, which were more theoretical. And so we did all these kind of things. And there's many. I go over this a lot in the book. I went over this a lot in the class. And the standard approach was really to kind of almost like a diagnosis, a very technocratic exercise. Well, we have this great divergence, very narrowly defined. Right? We doesn't have any. What is included in GDP? What's excluded? A lot of stuff is excluded, and you've already mentioned that GDP itself is highly problematic. Something that economists have known for decades, but we still use it. That's another story. So you have this kind of thing. So you just go down the checklist. Well, was this? Was that? Then you look at. Then you start. Then it broadened out from Britain. It was Europe. Europe was special, and the rest of the world just sort of, I don't know, just didn't lose the plot. They had to learn from the West. So that was this really exceptionalist model. Now, Pomerantz is quite interesting because Pomerantz in the neoclassical side, but Mike Davis on more the sort of Marxist side, and they both come to the same conclusion, is that, well, a lot of the fall, particularly of China, Davis also focuses on India and Brazil. But Pomerantz quite convincingly argues that, well, a lot of this really was that, there was extraction going on, otherwise known as imperialism, of various sorts, and that the West, his argument is that Europe basically was constantly using its environmental slack. And of course, you do see this in European history. It's not like a quiet, even within England, right? There's the enclosure movement, there's deforestation, there's people being, kind of the putting out system, people sort of being driven really essentially by either incentive or by hook or by crook into factories, or what became factories. And so, I mean, that's in England itself. And of course, in Europe, you see similar kinds of things, peripheral people, rural peoples being essentially driven out of in some one way or another over time into these sort of structures over time. But he said basically they ran out of environmental slack that they could use. They cut down all the forests and use all the resources, and so they began to use a slack that was available elsewhere, particularly in China. And so he makes a pretty convincing argument that a lot of this divergence, he's not just saying this, but a lot of this divergence came from the West managing to take other people's environmental surplus in the form of colonialism. He focuses on China, but this is a general kind of argument. And this is again one thing. Even though when I was taking economic history back in the 80s, we studied imperialism, but imperialism then, and there's still an aspect, a field in this, was about the rates of return to Western imperialism. What was the rates of return? And of course, no surprise perhaps, if in neoclassical economics, the rates of returns, it's debatable. It might have been a net loss economically. Some people say it was a net gain. Some say it was neutral. I mean, even when I was learning this stuff, it was like, somehow this doesn't quite
add up, does it?
Why don't you, there was all these kind of stories. But I think now most people have discarded that and said, yes, this was clearly a net gain. But the question is how much and how significant a part. I'm not saying this is the only thing that's going on with great divergence, but it's very clear that, the projection of power into non-Western areas, and the taking of resources, and then the reshaping of an entire world economy into core and periphery. That's another theme that you see a lot. This is clearly a big part of the divergence story. It's not just markets are magical. By the way, I'll just mention something about markets because I have a big interest in economic methodology and the history of thought. And markets, I didn't learn this in graduate school, but later on I learned that markets do not emerge out of neoclassical theory. You cannot get to market exchange based on the assumptions of theory. Everyone thinks all this stuff comes out of the theory, but no, you actually have to posit that there is a market for exchange. And then you can apply the model. But so again, market, or what I call marketization in the book, which is a big part of capitalism. A lot of this is about let's create exchange mechanisms and let's commodify things that can be exchanged through these market processes. And a lot of that is built on conscious or unconscious, I don't know, but deliberate policy choices and deliberate action. So anyway, that's a bit, I kind of again meandered a lot, but it's a great divergence is this thing where, again, economists will understand it as sort of just a natural process that has now reversed itself. See, now we've got the great convergence. Now per capita GDP is now converging. And see, doesn't that show that everything about sort of this evolutionary type of model, right? Almost a Darwinian model, survival of the fittest and blah, 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 blah. So.
No, absolutely. And we'll come back to the international dimensions of, the whole debate around multipolarity, which has been kicked off in a different mode or sort of perhaps a return to a very traditional mode by Marco Rubio's speech at Munich, talking about 500 years of Western expansion without all the dirty business mentioned, so to speak. But indeed the fact that, as Pomerantz and most historians say, the rise of the West is actually much later and more frailer and more violent and feeble than most of those. It's really like a 1800 story rather than a 1500 story. But one of the big transformations that does occur is, and you really focus a lot on this in your book and your writing, is the sort of social, cultural transformation in people. And you do, as you say, you're a very interdisciplinary approach, and you sort of draw on one of my particular favourites, Norbert Elias, or Elias, I'm not quite sure how you say it, but who was like a German emigre, Polish, I'm not sure, German emigre sociologist in Britain in the 1930s, who wrote this famous book, The Civilizing Process, returning to the idea of Western civilization. And you use his ideas in a very interesting way to describe how this big economic transformation since 1800 has not only affected the economy, it's affected people's psychology and society. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yes, I'll just make one point about, by the way, when you mentioned about the 1800s, if you look at just the kind of regular neoclassical economic data, a lot of careful research, basically, just in terms of, well, when did it really start? Basically, most people recognize that basically living standards for most people did not improve in Europe until 1830 at the earliest. And probably more like 1850. And this is just looking at, the kind of the data, pretty careful data, but still economic data. So that's just one point. I want to mention that. Like a lot of people say, oh, everyone got rich, and it's like, no, not everyone got rich. And it took a long time.
Indeed, there was, from my recollection, there's reversals of life expectancy and things like that.
That's right. No, that's right. Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So if you look beyond economic data, that's the other thing too. You do see even a sort of a much more fragmented picture. And of course, the wave of revolutions in Europe in 1830 and 1848, are sort of indicative. A lot of people say, well, that's indicative that maybe living standards weren't so great. So that was just an aside there that I agree. Most people are saying that, no, this is as a mass phenomenon, economic growth and development really came pretty late and was gradual. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But just about Elias, I read widely, but I'm not trained as a sociologist. So when I was teaching, when I started to teach the class the first time, the world economy since 1800, it was like, well, now I got to be careful here. And I'm definitely going to teach the economic models because these are economic students, third-year economics graduate students. And of course, I'm trained in this stuff, and I'm not dismissing it. I'm not saying it's junk. I'm saying, all right, well, this is an approach. But I'm saying, well, how can I teach the other stuff? And a lot of times, economic historians, traditionally trained, they'll tack on stuff. I call this sort of the Christmas tree approach. to interdisciplinarity. Well, here's the
Mm.
core economic Christmas tree, but we have a little thing here that's about sociology, And of course, a lot of people like Jared Diamond. That's a big economist. Love Jared Diamond. I don't really think much of his prognostications, and I actually did teach that in class, including critiques of it. But it's a very attractive parallel model. Well, there's geography matters, that kind of thing, and that's all that matters. So I was thinking, I really was doing some research. Well, I don't want to just tack these things on. I want to have another model that is more sociological, that is also has structure, as a kind of core structure and predictive things. And that's how I came upon Elias. I pronounce him Elias. Maybe I'm mispronouncing it as well. So actually,
look, I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm just saying Elias, and I think it is. I think people have heard it.
Yeah.
I haven't looked it up online. So Elias, was right. He was in Germany. He was an emigre from Nazi Germany. He was Jewish. And I won't go into how he got to his work, but he basically posited some very careful archival research over in looking at medieval and particularly medieval and Renaissance Europe, that he found these processes, that there was this process that social change consisted of a feedback between change at the collective social level, that social structures would change, social values would change, and change at the individual psyche level. And he particularly was focusing on inhibitions of animal behaviors and the use of violence. That was kind of a big thing. And he said, what he found is basically people became more and more socialized, and socialized to not use violence individually, to have violence outsourced or upsourced to the state. Not just, okay, I'll take out my sword and cut off your head. It's kind of like, all right, no, you can't do that. Call the police, they handle that. Or the knights, the medieval knights, let's just fight these other knights. It's like, no, the state declares war. But also just things like, spitting at the table, using utensils. I mean, he just found that there was this gradual process where people became socialized to just become more civilized in that sense. But he found that this wasn't just imposed on people, that it was internalized by people. That in fact, and basically to cut a kind of a very complex theory, a very subtle theory down, it's really just this notion that we become more self-monitoring and more monitoring of how others are perceiving us. And he says this is kind of really a condition of modernity, that what's happening is now we are in a weird way. It sounds strange because we're in such a, kind of a violent world and seemingly uninhibited world. But in a weird way, what happens is we are now much more self-regulating based on what we perceive other people's reactions and perceptions are. And interestingly enough, he did write about Nazi Germany. That is a phenomenon. A lot of people put that traditionally as well, that's the fall of civilization. And Elias did not agree with that. Elias said, actually, this is a perverted civilizing process. The process is the same. There's, social changes interacting with changing the individual psyche that then go back and forth. And of course, not all people are equal. Obviously, there's elite groups that are driving the social changes. But he said that no, in Nazi Germany, that's an example, and this is what can happen. That is not just, he's not a directional person, unlike a lot of economists implicitly are, that there's this notion of, and technocrats, this notion of progress. It's linear progress. So you go up and down, but we're going to ultimately get better. He says, no, this is not taken for granted. And that's, he wrote in Nazi Germany as a particular example, that no, this went awry. And of course, I'd say, arguably, that's a lot of what's happening now. That's kind of my own perspective, but I'll leave that for.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no, and it's a very profoundly influential body of work in history as well, and in a way, there's a bridge there between economic thinking, because it focuses on, I guess, processes unintentionally leading to a result, if you like, rather than the grand, the hidden hand sort of thing. I think it's a really wonderful way of thinking about it.
And it worked well with teaching, I'll just say too. It was a good, I don't know how many students picked up on it, but it worked well to have a framework. I see that was not incompatible, but sort of augmented. And then of course, then having worked well in teaching, I said, okay, this can actually work well in understanding the world.
And what are some of the examples of that kind of process working out that you focus on in your book and in your teachings as well?
So, there's many as you go through the history. So one of the early ones, and this is actually a big topic in standard economic history, is the way that's done by economists, is factory discipline. So, and there's a lot of work on this, a lot of very careful work, interesting work. How did you get people these are basically talking about peasant or craft populations, right? That are kind of used to just natural rhythms. They might work in teams at times, but basically they're just going with natural rhythms, and they're not confined to let's get up at 5 a.m. and then we finish at 10 at night. It's and we just do these repetitive processes the kind of the great division of labor that Adam Smith was celebrating. Well, that's pretty tedious and not a natural thing that most people take to. There might be a few people who do like that kind of thing, but most people will say, this is kind of hard. I'm tired of doing this. Let me stop. Let me take a 3-hour break. Actually, I don't feel like working today. All these kind of things. And so factory discipline, and you can see this in the history there, was a very deliberate, systematic, but decentralized process at the same time of really training people to, sit doing a task repetitively all day into the night, and then doing it again. And then at first really having no days off except for Sunday, but then, eventually having more time off. And of course, this, it's interesting, mass education. Compulsory public education. Now, that has a lot of functions to it. I'm not trying to reduce it to this, but one of the functions is to socialize and get people used to, and almost really, in one sense, get them sort of adapted to. Again, I don't want to say this is totally negative. So some people say, well, what the free kids, break their chains and run free. That was sort of very popular pedagogy in the 1960s, 1970s, that kind of philosophy. But, I don't adhere to that either. So that's one example, factory discipline. And another example from a later part of history, as industrialization got further on, is mass consumption. And you can see this very clearly. I talk about this in the book, and you can see this in the history of advertising and in public relations, which is a very, very interesting topic, totally ignored, even a lot by historians. But people used to there was a culture of thrift, that carried over from sort of old peasant and rural and sort of, poverty sorts of ideas. So of course, no, why would I, use more than I need? Why would I buy stuff I don't want? And then there's, also this, so you don't want to spend too much, but you don't have that many appetites anyway. Right. So there's a big shift. And this is by the way, there's a debate about when the process of getting people more into consumerism, when that actually started. Some people put that back in the commercial revolution, for example. There's a whole literature about that. But without getting into that, I'm talking about mass consumption, not the rise of the consumer. That's, I think, a more long-term.
And mass advertising, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Right. And you see this shift, including the use of Freud's models, Edward Bernays, one of the fathers, two fathers of public relations. Ivy Lee is one of them, and Edward Bernays is the other one, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he used his uncle's sort of theories to say, well, gee, how do we stimulate demand? And you see, he's not the only figure who does this, but he's a pretty seminal figure in basically shifting away from utilitarian advertising, just looking at advertising alone, where it's like, okay, you should buy this car because it's cheaper. And, it's got better gas mileage or whatever, instead it's like, you should buy this car because it makes you sexy, in case you're more of a man. Or it's a big one with cars. And I've done a lot of studies of the history of the automobile is like, well, it's freedom. This is always an interesting thing. We still have this. Well, the open road the automobile is freedom. And I kind of think, well, it's expensive to own an automobile. You have to park it. You have to maintain it. You don't see a lot when you're driving. Like, how is this freedom? But this is kind of, again, inculcated in people's and in a sense, it is freedom in a certain sense, but not freedom the way we think of it. So those are a couple of examples from sort of two parts of the Industrial Revolution, one more the first Industrial Revolution, one more the second, where you can just see, just right out there, the process going on where they're trying to shape collective psychology, and it is affecting individual psychology. I'm not saying entirely negatively. I do want to make that clear, and because Elias said the same thing, not entirely negatively, but it was necessary, and it did happen. It's not just sort of, all right, we're still rational actors, homo economicus, and we just sort of respond to incentives and get rich, or if we don't get rich, we didn't deserve to be rich. Like, it's just not that simple.
Can I ask you about like a contemporary example of one of these kind of processes that, show how, I guess, the way in which the economy is, realize is very much shaped by ideas and social models and that sort of thing, which is the whole debate around AI.
Yeah.
So there's an argument around the traps that in the West, in America, Anglo world, AI is very much developing the sort of, the large language model, the, giant brain kind of that will do away with our own intelligence sort of approach to things. And a debate about whether it's sort of reached the limits of that model, like, whether it can actually, is it physically possible to produce the processing power to actually achieve what they want to achieve. And some people say, by contrast, China has adapted a much more specific manufacturing sort of, embedded in physical process approach to AI, much more about robotics and logistics and things like that. And, I don't know enough about the topic to really comment specifically, but I do think it's an interesting example of how, economics has a social form. I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess I'd have two aspects to it. One, just in terms of cultural differences in technological development. There's a lot of literature on this. In fact, Elias himself wrote about this, and he calls this technization, which is the adaptation of humans to technology in particular. He's not the only one who wrote about it, but I just mentioned he does have work on this. And just an example that occurs to me, this is kind of back more from, the Cold War days, but, for example, there was, and I knew enough people in the sort of programming world that, Russians had back then had a very different attitude towards programming than Americans did. So Russians worked in a resource-poor environment. So they sort of just did things that were, almost very clever in a lot of ways, right? Very basic, but very clever. Sometimes not the most efficient, but they did the job. And that was kind of the sort of the way that they program. Whereas Americans, are sort of used to, we have all the resources we want, and we'll just, throw tons of programmers at it and tons of processing power, and so we've developed more that way. And I think that's in part, I don't want to simplify totally. I don't want to make that as a firm statement, but I just remember that back in the old days.
Yeah, there was an old joke that in the space program, the Americans spent like $10 million to invent a gravity-defying ink pen, and the Russians just picked up a lead pencil.
That's right. I haven't heard that story, but I remember. I can remember things like that, exactly. And so I think that's a continuation of a lot of what we've got now in a lot of ways. And that some of that is just cultural. Of course, some of that is economic as well. Americans are used just to having particularly since the end of World War I, but certainly since the end of World War II, I've been used to just having whatever resources, not individuals necessarily, but people who have capital. They've been used to having whatever resources they want. So I think there are definitely cultural, and if you want to put it in the civilizational thing, there's civilizational differences as well. And China, has got an ancient history, and it's got a much different way of dealing with things and approaching things. And also it's used to, when you think about what's happened to Russians over the last 100 years and what's happened to Chinese over the last 100 years, and you think what happened to Americans and over the last 100 years, it's like, it's surprising that, like, for us, like, well, I'm an Australian now, but when I was put my American hat on, you think it was like, how do they even survive all that stuff, the privation and all the cleverness and all the resourcefulness that they had to do just to survive. And Americans really, in the main, haven't really gone through that. So I think that's one answer. But in terms of, just AI generally, I've actually looked at this a lot because of the work I do in transport human factors and the role of AI. And it's very clear if you read the sort of philosophical literature and a lot of the technical literature, that AI, what people are saying AI can do, it just never has done and never will do. And I can see this in transport, the whole notion of self-driving vehicles, for example, that truly autonomous vehicles and open systems, they've been talking about that for 40 years. 40 years they've been talking about it since I've been in transport. That's just my field. Still hasn't come. Eventually you start saying, I don't really think this is possible. But what you can do, and I think this is really the approach of people who believe in AI. They don't say this, but what it is, let us design as closed a system as possible that removes the human as much as possible. And that's very much a human factors engineering. Let's get rid of human error. And how do you get rid of human error? You get rid of human error by first adapting people to the machines. And then you get rid of human error by getting rid of the humans. And this is a very dark side of the whole singularity, right? Ray Kurzweil's singularity vision, that we're going to merge with our machines. I mean, I have a lot of contempt. I will say this. I've studied this a lot. I'm open to sort of counter arguments, but I have a lot of contempt for a lot of the prognostications that are made because you can really blow them apart if you just do any kind of study, and they're just pretty dark.
Yeah.
So anyway, but in a sense, we talk about, again, back to Elias, socialization and individual psyche changes. I mean, we are playing with an uncontrolled experiment, essentially, very large scale, both with individual psyches and at the social level, that supposedly has this glorious ending. But based on what evidence? And the evidence I see so far, I think anyone, as we say in Australia, right, blind Freddy.
Yeah, that's right. Good old blind Freddy.
Could see that this doesn't work.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I also get, and I guess the outcome is unknown, but it does seem there's an increasingly, a pushback against these kind of very technicist sort of visions, the Palantirs and the Peter Thiels and the singularity, the Silicon Valley sort of, eternal life through the ether, that sort of world, and just at a very practical level, people are talking about, spending more time online, offline and online, and there's more talk about the disappointments, I guess, of AI, but we'll see. How
this resistance just a techno, because this goes way back. The Luddites, right, who smashed the weaving machines, for example. But it's this happens with like the automobile, definitely the automobile. There was, when the automobile started becoming much more prominent in cities. It was very dangerous, and traditionally pedestrians had the right of way. They had the right of way. And there was a big campaign, however, by the auto manufacturers, by highway engineers, and this is well documented. This is interesting historical literature there, to basically make automobiles have priority over things that for centuries had been a pedestrian enclave. And they even the term jaywalker, which is an American term, was invented by advocacy groups. Because Jay used to be like an old term for sort of a knockabout ne'er-do-well, kind of, or a stupid kind of fool kind of person. And they said they came up with this term. This is public relations, jaywalker. Do you want to be a jaywalker? Don't be. Just let the cars go. So I mean, these resistances have been, human beings have resisted being machine-ified, if you will, because it just doesn't feel very right, And now what's happened is materially we're not really getting any payoff. In fact, we're getting negative payoffs. So, the car is one thing. You can say, well, all right, that brought productivity, that brought some mobility. All right, there were some positive gains to conforming to that machine, even though there were a lot of negatives. But now you can sort of say, I'm getting a lot of negatives, but, one has to ask, like, where are all the positives? Where are they? I'm asking that as a question, right? So it's kind of like a lot of people are saying, I'm not really getting any better quality of life. I'm not getting any more money for what I do. I'm more insecure than ever. In fact, I can't even get my questions answered by the bots that supposedly are smart. You can't even get an answer to them. You can't talk to a human being, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think we all know the frustrations.
Yeah. Like even like on YouTube at the moment, there's a huge pushback against AI slop, and indeed YouTube itself has been going through this process of purging a lot of AI generated channels because it's sort of degraded the brand by having all this AI slop.
Yes.
And so is ultimately, it's sort of like it's the tragedy of the commons, if you like, in the digital world, almost. There's that discussion around AI really links to two other big issues that I was keen to ask you about. One is, one big debate at the moment is the rise of China. And the economic historian Adam Tooze, I guess you could call him a historian as well, has, I believe he's actually writing a book, which is like he's written the history of the financial crisis and all this sort of thing. But I think he's writing a book at the moment about the sort of climate, environmental sort of policy debate. And he makes the point that over the last 30 years or so, the industrial transformation in China, just in terms of industrial output and energy production or energy use, all this sort of stuff, has been a scale of change that is on a par with or even exceeds the Industrial Revolution change of Europe in the late 18th, early 19th century. And that in many ways, I think what he's arguing is a bit like what you're saying with your old models, new realities, that in thinking about the rise of China, we have to sort of discard some of our old models about what the world economy looks like to come to terms with just the actual scale of the change. And for him, it's particularly important in relationship to the the managing energy transitions and things like that. He basically says, the West doesn't matter anymore, or, it is not where the real action is. The real action is with China to some degree. What are your reflections on the whole rise of China debate and how that fits into your work on the history of the economy since 1800?
Yes, well, to some degree, of course, if you just look even just at GDP per capita data historically, now Madison is the core, the typical source for that. Best we've got. But I mean, if you just look at that, even as limited as it is, you do see in history there's just cycles, right? So in one sense, multipolarity, just nothing surprising whatsoever, just in that sense of things. And of course, China has traditionally been one of the great powers at various times. It's an ancient state, right? And it's sort of, so it's kind of like, this is not surprising in that sense. Now, the question is what's happening now. And I have obviously, I don't know what's going to happen. This is one thing I would like to say. I have no idea what's going to happen. I really don't. A lot of people ask me as an economist, economic historian, it's a kind of a crazy world. It's very actually hard to figure out what's going on. And history, in some sense, is not a great guide. It's the only guide we have. In some ways, it's not a great guide. And with respect to China, so my way of looking at things, because I've thought about this, particularly I wrote about comparative economic systems in the book. And, in the Cold War, there was a whole study of that. And then I began to think about changes in economic systems across the globe since 1800, since 1700. And one thing you notice, at least I've noticed, is that, we had much greater variety of economic, social, political systems in 1700 than we did in 1800. And even in the Cold War, essentially what you had was an industrial platform. That was the way to get ahead. So Soviet industrialization looked quite different from American or British industrialization, but it came down to industrialization. And this is why that model, with tweaks, was so attractive to a lot of decolonizing nations, India being one of them. And, so that was democratic state planning, but, with some market involved, so. And now what's happened is, I think what we've got is, in a lot of ways, an ecosystem that's sort of a monoculture as far as the basic platform, which is industrialism. I call it industrialism as opposed to industrialization, with other things that go with that, such as what Max Weber called rationalization, the kind of bureaucratization and formalization of everything, which is necessary when you have a large-scale production consumption machine. So in one sense, when people talk about what's happening with China, China in some ways is really just doing an industrial platform, and is doing it in a sort of almost classical technocratic way in some ways. A lot of people say, what are you talking about? It's corrupt. There's all these kind of things. Singapore, it's very similar in a lot of ways, in some ways, to how Singapore runs things. Not obviously identical, but similar, not surprising. There's a lot of Chinese obviously running Singapore. So a lot of ways, this is the kind of interesting thing, is that in one sense, I see essentially the way we've got the world designed now, which is we have to mass produce because we have 8 billion people. And to get any kind of hope of sort of material abundance, we have to mass distribute and mass consume. And then you've got the resource side of it. How do you manage the resource implications? And it's true, given that system, you have to have large technical systems to manage the resource problems of it. Now, whether those are truly workable solutions like the energy transition, that's another question. I mean, I have a lot of doubts as to whether these, like the energy transition and other technical solutions, are actually going to get us out of this problem. But let's accept that they do. Then I agree. In that sense, I won't say I disagree with twos, but I think in one sense, I think I put it in this frame is that it's not so much that China is unique in that sense, but China is doing it its way. And it turns out right now, in this context, to be a way that is very efficient and very effective relative to what's on offer in most Western countries.
So it's almost like a late wave of industrial modernization, so to speak, that has come to China, so to speak, rather than being a break into a different kind of world.
No, it's sort of like, this is just thinking out loud, but in some sense, they've had their first industrial revolution, which came really not with Mao. I mean, because Mao, whatever, was a romantic at heart, so he just was. He was doing the Soviet model for a while, then it was like whatever, all these things, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But then Deng Xiaoping, who did it in an enclave basis, which is interesting. He did, let's try it in Hong Kong, let's try it in southern China around Hong Kong. Unlike the Soviets, the Chinese looked at the Soviet example quite with a lot of both trepidation and don't do the whole economy at once, which in some sense is what Gorbachev did, and he wrecked. I mean, the thing was falling apart, but he really caused the wreck of it right there. Whereas Deng said, we need to industrialize. We're not really industrialized. Let's use these Western models. And that was the first industrial revolution. And then they became the workshop to the world, right? But now I'd say, we're in the second industrial revolution, which is in the West, back in 1870 to 1930. That's the rough period. You had electricity. You had, automobiles invented. You had modern pharmaceuticals. You had photography. You had phonography. You had films invented. You had chemical synthetics. I mean, these things all happened. And we're still working off that platform in the West. We haven't really innovated. And even computers, right, came out in the 1920s. Versions of, before then, but, you had sort of working computers then that were analog. So I'd say in a lot of ways what China is doing is its second industrial revolution. It's in its own second, particular version of the second industrial revolution. And, nobody else, well, they're pretty much, I won't say nobody else is. I don't want to be that, but certainly I can't see it in, for example, in Google, or Palantir or, Facebook, Meta. I mean, you look at American enterprises or Western enterprises generally, I don't see that level. It's not second industrial revolution type stuff. So that's kind of, again, I'm thinking out loud here, but that's how I kind of bounce off too, is I think there is something unique going on there, and yet there is precedent, and it makes sense in economic history of industrialization.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. That, I guess, brings us to the final question I kind of wanted to ask you within the time, which was, another way of conceiving this period of the last couple of hundred years of economic history is the Anthropocene, the sort of idea that there's been a unique way in which humans have, as in anthropos, have remolded the physical world, the natural world over the last couple of hundred years, and that sort of defines the mode of our time. And in a way, I guess it's similar to what you were saying there about formalization, or rationalization, and industrialism. But what's your and this is so many of the debates and issues that concern people are the life of the planet, and water supplies, and all the sort of things where we come up against natural constraints in our physical environment, protection of species, biodiversity, all that sort of stuff. What's your perspective on the sort of historical arguments about Anthropocene?
Well, as a concept, of course, the international body that recognizes sort of geological ages has not accepted the Anthropocene. So I'm not trying to say that it invalidates it, but that's just, they said that we don't have the evidence for it, just from that standpoint. Now, it's pretty clear that anthropogenesis of the climate is happening, and that's been happening quite a while. If you look, and even certainly at a local level, it's been happening forever. I mean, if you look at human activity, like London, right, was having smog, back, there were regulations against, burning peat in London back in the 1600s, for example. So I mean, this is not a new thing, changing the local climate, and really it makes sense that now we've got a globalized system. We've got 8 billion people on the planet, or roughly thereabouts. I have to check the exact numbers. So sorry if I'm misspeaking slightly off, but so it makes sense that, of course, right now we don't have a regional climate, we have a global climate, and we're doing things that clearly are affecting. So in that sense, of course, this is happening. I think the thing about the Anthropocene, I mentioned this in the book as well, is that in a lot of ways in the 70s, right, this kind of starting in the 60s, particularly in the 70s, right, the whole limits to growth came up. A lot of people saying, like, we just can't sustain this. Of course, it was much more visible to middle class people and elites, right? When the Cuyahoga River and Cleveland caught fire, these are kinds of things that were like, okay, yeah, this, like, it was right in their face. So right now it's like, yeah, we have climate change, but a lot of people, it just seems, oh, it's an extra hot summer. It's like, it's, not that they don't notice it, but they don't notice it the same way. So, and back then you did have a debate about consumption. At least it was there. Maybe we shouldn't be consuming so much. Maybe we shouldn't be producing so much. And one of the standard models you have is called the IPAT model for impact. Impact equals, population times affluence times technology. And what we've been focusing on, this is the thing about the Anthropocene, and particularly our policy responses based on the Anthropocene model, which is essentially a technical scientific model, which essentially says that the Earth is a technical system, basically, that human beings are wrecking, and that we have to adjust and save the Earth. And I always like to joke that the Earth is saving us. We're not saving the Earth. We're kind of incidental to the Earth. I mean, the Earth will get fine in that sense, fine without us. There'll be climate change. We might end as a species, but the Earth is not. We're not saving any of the Earth. The Earth will continue. But I'm saying that not in a negative way, but just in the sense of like, well, what are we really doing? And I think nobody looks at. Everyone looks at technology. This includes China, right? It looks at technological solutions. iPad, or let's just get and a lot of people say, let's get technology as advanced as possible. This is what the energy transition is about, for example. And then we can consume and produce kind of as before, right? And that's kind of, I know, do you believe that or not believe it? I don't happen to believe it. So, I think there's a lot of reasons why we have to change the way we live. But, first of all, that we couldn't change that quickly. We can't just suddenly go back to like E.F. Schumacher's book, right? Small is beautiful.
No.
We get that. That's just not possible. But so it had to be gradual. But it's also like, nobody is pushing that. Even in China, Chinese are not pushing for less consumption or less affluence. Their social compact, right, is like most industrialized states. Is you let us kind of run this system, and you'll get more stuff. And that's sort of the social compact that the West has had for a long time. That's breaking now. And China is, I would say, delivering on it overall. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is delivering it all. But on the other hand, from an ecological point of view, one has to question.
So how do you respond to that dilemma, I guess, as an individual? Like, I guess that's a dilemma a lot of us face, isn't it? Like we feel, it's like the being on a runaway sort of train, and you can't really do anything about all the power systems and all the big changes and all that sort of stuff. But how do you live on the runaway train?
Yeah, and this is, of course, this is true of all. Because climate's only one problem that we have. Obviously, we see a lot of tremendously ugly things going on, that are just not stopped. It's clear. So, I've had to grapple with this like everybody else does. Yeah. Now, and I still do the work I do. I used to do it because I thought perhaps telling a version of the truth anyway, as near the truth as I could get, might, begin to have an impact on people. I no longer, I shouldn't say I assume that doesn't happen, but it's not my motivation. I say, okay, look, even if I get some people to understand some things, and they happen to be true, so I'm not false things, then what difference is it going to make given the current atmosphere and the current power structures we have? So So I've come more. This is my current thing. Partly I do live simply, so partly it is true. I do, kind of, I'm not a big consumer. I'm still a consumer. I'm a middle class person, So, but I don't have a car, for example, and I don't recycle. I actually just reuse things, So I use, old bags, all that kind of stuff, So I live well, but I don't, I kind of do that. But more importantly, I think, I do think about like Gabor Mate. You may have heard of him. Who, he talks about that. There's moral injury going on. That many actions around the world, climate is just about one of them, is injuring us. There are things going on that are clearly reprehensible, that don't make any sense, and that we can't do anything about. And that's moral injury. And so partly just to help them recognize, okay, this is not me being bad or me being, somehow defective, or even that I have much agency in doing it. Like, it's just, I don't have much agency, and it's moral injury is being done. But then and he's made this point, it's like, but I still carry on doing what I am meant to do with the gifts I've got. And this is the books have come out of. It's like they were my attempt to make more sense of things, and it's what I do. And I'm fortunate that I can do them. I'm in a position where I can do them, and and I just have to carry on doing that, knowing that, all right, there's something greater, whatever that is, certainly greater than me, certainly greater than these power structures, that, it's going to play out the way it's going to play out. And ultimately, I don't want to say good will win out exactly, but that an order will be restored, the natural order of things. Hopefully it's with human beings in the mix. Hopefully our species survives and is part of that, but I don't know if we will or not, but I just have to do what I have to do and just carry on and just do it with, dedication.
Yeah.
And trying, and just, that's what I can do. So that's kind of, and that's not totally satisfying, I'd have to say, but it has helped me carry on, because it's very hard to carry on when you see what's going on without putting your head in the sand, which I don't want to do either.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a reflection that a lot of people can relate to. And, I mean, one of the things I often find frustrating in talking about, or I try to connect to in talking about all these sort of big world issues, is, this thing that so much of it is simply out of our realm of experience or any kind of effective control, but yet we need to find a way to live well within that. And I think those words you had there, I think a lot of people will take to heart. So thank you so much, Cameron.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining me, Cameron. I'll, of course, leave details about your book and indeed perhaps your article on technocracy that people might want to read as well, given it's an often controversial topic on YouTube, in the video description below. But thanks so much for joining me today, Cameron.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. My pleasure.